I appreciate that. David McAfee will be giving a talk today. He has, I think, obviously survived St. Patrick's Day.
Yes.
Okay. I was a little worried, being Irish and all. I know how that works. I've been over there. Yeah, they're a happy bunch. David was here in 2015, and his talk at that time was the importance of teaching children about religion. And it went over quite well, and that's one of the reasons he's back again, because it was a good experience. He's been doing a book tour, starting up north, working his way down here, and I think by the time he's finished, there will be very few Christians left in this state.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so David has two Bachelor of Arts degrees, one in English and another one in studies of Christianity with the Religious Studies group. The books he's published so far are Disproving Christianity and Other Secular Writings. That was his first one, and he was just in the college town at that time, going to school, and he was very encouraged because it went over quite well. And I think that got him on the path of going in and starting to publish some more and get his ideas expressed in a book. His second book is Disproving Christianity and Other Secular Writings. And that was also well received. So, and then he came in and published another book called Mom, Dad, I'm an Atheist, coming out as an atheist. So some people who have had trouble trying to come out and express themselves that they no longer believe what they were told when they were a kid, he can help them if they read the book, okay? The Belief book is one that we got the last time while he was here. It's a book for children and explains religion and beliefs by the different religions. And then we have, let's see, another book is called the Book of Gods. Look at different gods, and I think that helps too, because the kids get some idea like, oh yeah, you're a Baptist or you're a whatever. It gives them an idea who they're worshiping and why each one has a somewhat different take on who God is, and it gets people thinking. And once we get people thinking, hey, we got them. Okay. Atheist Answers, Rational Responses to Religious Questions is another one. And then today's talk is going to be by his book, No Sacred Cows, Investigating Myths, Cults, and the Supernatural. It's one that I think you really appreciate. I think it's gotten rave reviews. As a matter of fact, he only came in here with 2 of the books. He sold out up north. But he will take orders. Yep. He will be in the back also to sign the books that he has, and to take orders for any other books that you may want to buy. Okay, so give it up for David McAfee.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate it. Okay. Is this live yet?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Cool. All right. Well, I think we're waiting for the presentation for a second, but I do want to thank you for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. As he mentioned, I've been here twice. This is my second time to Tucson, to this group specifically. And I just want you guys to give yourselves a round of applause for such an established and involved group. I'm really impressed by that, so thank you. I'd also like to start out by gauging the room with a pretty simple question. How many of you have heard of Maria Sibylla Merian? Say it again. Maria Sibylla Merian. I saw one hand out there. That's not all that surprising. If you haven't, it's okay, because she was born in 1647 at a time when women were considered inferior and incapable of scientific pursuits. It was believed that the rigorous life of a researcher would interfere with the domestic duties of women. And I know what you're all thinking. There's no way anyone today would hold that mindset. This is completely outdated, right? No? Okay. Well, someday maybe. So she was a scientist at heart, but she didn't have the ability to be what she wanted to be in that time. She didn't have the option to become a scientist. So at 13 years old, she started drawing instead. She started drawing insects, butterflies, silkworms, and ultimately she became the first person to document the life cycle of a butterfly. That's something that took scientific know-how more than just artistry. And today, her work is referenced not just by artists, but by scientists. And she is considered by many people to be one of the first ecologists ever, the first to hold that title, because she is one of the first to actually perform that scientific study, to watch them so closely that she could record every single stage of their life cycle. And I see now that we finally have some pictures up here. These are her actual drawings, and they were just incredible. But beyond being talented at art, she was talented at science, and that's pretty impressive. She didn't have any formal scientific training, but she did have curiosity, and that's what really helped her along that. So my point in telling you this is that we can all learn to think like scientists, and we should all try to do so. No matter what you have going on in your daily life, she obviously couldn't be a scientist, but she chose to use those skills anyway and put them to the test, and I appreciate that. We can all research, we can all look at data, and we can all draw conclusions from that data. And so I feel like it's important that we do that as much as humanly possible. And the fact is that we actually do use science in our daily lives, whether we realize it or not. Anytime we deduce something using evidence, whether it's deciding which item to buy and gauging the value, you're using these skills. So we've actually been using all these skills since we were babies. And a lot of people don't realize that. But the basic steps of the scientific method are make an observation, form a hypothesis, perform the experiment, analyze the data, report your findings, and invite others to reproduce the results. And as you can see here, this baby is poisoning this other baby. But it's in the name of science, so it's okay. So I feel like we should all be doing this more often. I am not a scientist. As Jerry mentioned, my only degrees are in English and religious studies. But I do have a few things needed to use science. I have curiosity, I have knowledge of the scientific method, I have a passion for the truth, and crucially, the ability to admit when I'm wrong, which is really important for this type of work. So 6 years ago, I decided to take on an important task, what I deemed to be an important task using those qualities. I decided to look beyond the religions that I studied for years in school and investigate all myths and superstitions and false beliefs in general, because I found that they are more connected than people realize. There's two reasons I took on this task. Number one is that all false claims have the potential to cause harm. That's not to say that all false claims cause harm all the time, all false beliefs cause harm all the time. There are certainly false beliefs that that are harmless, but they all have the potential to cause harm because they have the potential to change how you act in your daily life based on false information. Some pseudosciences, to use a recent example in the alternative healing area, I discovered a group of people on Facebook of about 500 people who drink and otherwise use turpentine, including in enemas, paint thinner, to cure any disease. They think that they have worms and bacteria in their body, and by inserting turpentine into it, they're able to cure any disease. So this is obviously on the most dangerous end of the spectrum. I infiltrated this group on Facebook as a believer in turpentine therapy and saw some of the most disturbing posts I've ever seen. Somebody saying, I've been doing this for three to 4 weeks, and there's red in my stool. Is this normal? And the people commenting, don't worry about it. That means it's working. Those are the dying bacteria. Those are the dying worms that are coming out of your body. And I'm like, that's your intestinal lining, and you're going to die. See a doctor. So that's on one end of the spectrum. Then you have false beliefs as simple as something like a rabbit's foot, a lucky rabbit's foot. That doesn't always cause harm, but what if one day you decide to change your course of actions based on that, based on whether you had that or don't, and then something bad could happen. So that's one of the more benign instances. The second reason I decided to expand and talk about all superstitions and all false beliefs, really, is that every study that I've seen, especially in the last few years, and I'm sure you guys have seen these as well, has shown that religion is waning. Religion is losing ground. More and more people are identifying as nones, are identifying as no religion in particular. And that's great news, something to celebrate. But those same studies show that belief in the supernatural is on an increase. So it doesn't mean that people are being more logical and more reasonable overall. It means people are rejecting, more likely, rigid dogmas, ancient holy texts, and the doctrines with which they were brought up. But they're more likely to believe in ghosts, in alien interactions here on Earth, in all sorts of unfounded conspiracy theories, in psychics, in any number of things. The numbers are going up. Anything that's not linked to an ancient holy text is going down. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, and I wanted to explore that as much as possible. So in my new book, In No Sacred Cows, I look into all sorts of false beliefs. Over the course of 6 years, I investigated everything from 9/11 conspiracy theories to Scientology to the Westboro Baptist Church. I went ghost hunting. I looked for Bigfoot. I basically did everything I could. And here are a few of the specific topics that I go over in the book. When it comes to ghosts, spirits, and specters, like I said, I did go to a haunted house, which a lot of people do when they investigate ghosts. But I also went beyond that to look for reasons people might see ghosts. I don't find that it's helpful to tell people they didn't see something that they say they did. So if they say, I saw a ghost, I'm not one to say, you didn't see anything. But I want to try and find out what they did see, or what's making them think that it's a ghost. And I talk about in the book one specific example in my own life. So as a skeptic, as an atheist, I had just graduated college, put out my second book, and I was just sitting up in bed, resting my back against the wall, and I heard my door handle of my apartment start to move. And obviously, I was a little freaked out. I was like, OK, somebody's trying to get into my apartment. It's locked. It's no big deal. Then the door pops open. A woman floats into my room about 2 feet off the ground. Long black hair. She looked exactly like you would picture a ghost looking, which should have been my first clue. She looked like she was from The Grudge. She looked like she had been in a well for 1,000 years. She had blue skin that was peeling off of her face. Her clothes were in tatters. Her white flowing clothes were in tatters. She floated toward me, and I was paralyzed with what I thought was fear. I was so terrified of this ghost that I couldn't move a muscle. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, she disappeared. And I was able to move again, and I was so scared. And I ran to my computer, and I Googled paralyzed ghost. I don't know why. That's the first thing that came to my mind. And I learned all about sleep paralysis, and that there's a condition that about 10–15% of the population suffers from at some point in their life that causes waking hallucinations accompanied by paralysis. It made complete sense. And now, every time I'm watching a ghost show of some kind, I hear these stories, and they're like, we can't explain it. We don't know what happened. I was laying in bed, and I was paralyzed. And I'm like, you had sleep paralysis. It's pretty common. It's a problem with the trigger between sleep and awake. You're in an in-between state. And your body thinks you're asleep, so you're paralyzed so that you don't fall out of a tree. And our ancestors could dream and sleep and not fall out of their trees. So we have that ability to be paralyzed, but it crosses over into waking life. And it's actually pretty terrifying if you don't know what's going on. So in addition to looking into things like this, I also looked into infrasound, which is a source of a lot of ghost beliefs. Infrasound are sounds, tones that are unrecognizable to the human ear, but we can feel them. And they can cause what's called a feeling of presence or a feeling of dread. They can cause your hair to stand on end for what seems like no reason. They can cause you to get shivers up your spine for nothing, just based on this presence. And so a lot of haunted houses might have infrasound being created naturally through the shape of a window and the wind hitting a window at a particular angle. It could happen. One famous researcher I talk about in the book who kind of discovered this phenomenon, discovered it because his office was haunted. Everyone who went into his office felt these feelings. They saw things. They didn't know what was going on. Then they replaced the air conditioner, and it was completely gone. So unless air conditioners are also ghosts, then I think the more likely culprit is infrasound. They also have certain fungi, certain mildews that can cause these hallucinations. There's lots of different reasons why someone might see a ghost, and I believe that that's what they saw, so kind of investigated what could be the reasons for that. I also talk about psychics and other so-called seers. And that's a fun one because a lot of people believe in psychics, and a lot of people have their personal story about this one psychic that knew something that they couldn't have known. And so I just started asking around and finding kind of the best psychics, and according to the people who were read by them. And then I interviewed them. And I went to a celebrity psychic who's done readings for Ellen DeGeneres and Eva Longoria and other people. And I interviewed her. I interviewed, actually in the book, 3 psychics and a mentalist who is a psychic who admits that they're just doing it to mess with your mind. And I really appreciated that. He's actually a really cool guy, and he's told me how they did everything. He was like, well, if they do this trick, here's how they did it. I do the same thing in my act, but the difference is I tell them it's an act. And I was kind of inspired, and I decided to become a psychic myself. And this is me doing a reading in Venice Beach. My name was Suro the Seer, and Suro is Horus backwards, which nobody noticed. It was actually a lot of fun. I learned about cold and hot reading tactics, and then I learned how to read people's faces, and then I just went out there, and I just wanted to see if I could convince anyone that I was a psychic, even though I was doing these free readings. Turns out I was pretty good at it. 90% success rate of people who said that I said something to them that couldn't have been known without some sort of a supernatural power. Obviously, they were wrong. It actually became a problem because one woman was so convinced that she refused to believe me when I revealed at the end that I was a skeptic and this was a social experiment. She said, no, you have to say that so you won't be put away in some science lab somewhere. And I was like, no, really, I mean, you can look at my stuff. I'm here. Please believe me. And another woman was so convinced that she was trying to give me money. And as a part of my whole process, I didn't take a cent from anyone. And she was insisting and handing me money. And she said, I could tell she had been ripped off by so many psychics because she said, oh, I know you expanded, you gave so much energy to give this reading, and I have to reimburse you for that energy. And I'm like, the spirit realm doesn't take your dollars, lady. And so that was a really fun experiment. But basically, that's how I investigated the psychic realm. And I talk about in the book exactly how to do it. So if you want to become a psychic yourself, it's really fun. I wore a shirt that said, I'm psychic, trust me. And nobody got the double meaning there either. In addition to those topics, I talk about alien intervention. And this is a controversial one, even for myself, because I believe that it's statistically likely that alien life exists elsewhere, possibly even intelligent alien life. But I don't believe that we have enough evidence to conclude that that alien life has visited us. And I make that case in the book, as well as the case that it's pretty narcissistic to assume that they would want to visit us, considering in the grand scheme of things, we're kind of just a run-of-the-mill planet. If you look into the diversity of outer space and think about it on that grand of a scale, but we kind of want to feel important, and we want to feel like somebody's watching over us. If we don't have a belief in the divine, belief in the alien overlords works as well. I also looked at the ancient alien hypothesis, which is the belief that our ancestors were so dumb that they couldn't stack rocks properly and they needed alien help to do so, and found that to be incredibly lacking in evidence. Definitely lots of conjecture, lots of subjective interpretations of what could or could not be done by our ancestors. But the fact is that our ancestors were intelligent, creative people, a lot like us. They didn't have the same technologies, but they had a lot more time on their hands. And with that, they could build a lot of pretty impressive stuff. I also talk about, in the book, faith healing and alternative medicines. I mentioned that a little bit earlier with the turpentine. Another example that I recently discovered at Rite Aid was Himalayan crystal pink salt inhalers. And it said it's a, quote, substitute for your, quote, chemical inhalers. And if you have an asthma attack, you should just reach for this pink salt crystals, and you'll be completely fine. And that's sold at Rite Aid, a pharmacy, a wellness store, and it could potentially kill people. So that's the type of stuff I talk about in the book, but a lot of people don't realize that alternative medicine also includes stuff like exorcisms. It's one of the first faith healings. Back in the day, thousands of years ago, if you had usually severe mental illness, somebody would come up and hit you in the head and hit you with some endorphins and some dopamine boosts, and you feel better for a few seconds, a few minutes, then they leave. And that's considered faith. That's a huge part of faith healing still today, and exorcisms are actually on the rise right now. The Catholic Church is reporting 300% increase in demands for exorcism, is how they put it. I see it as a 300% increase in demands for mental illness help that they are meeting with exorcism, but I digress. So those are just a few of the things that I talk about in the book. I also, in the faith healing chapter, I talk about the Church of Christ Scientists. Have you guys heard of this? That's a faith healing group that actually believes you can resurrect human beings through prayer alone. And they believe that it's been done and that they have proof that it's been done. So I was like, okay, I got to interview these people. I got to figure out what's going on. So I met a woman at the reading room at the Church of Christ Scientists, and actually surrounded by books that she said were filled with evidence that this can be done, that they can cure any disease, including death, with prayer. So after our interview, which is published in the book, I asked to look at some of the books on the shelves. She said yes. I opened to a random page. It says, John L. was cured by a prayer of his asthma on this date. Next line. Jane F. was cured by... No other details, no hospital records, nothing at all. And they were satisfied with that. Those were testimonies that meant enough to them to conclude that it was not only possible, but that it happened regularly. The woman said that I asked her if she had ever met anyone who had been resurrected via prayer, and her exact quote was, I think my friend's sister did. I remember she died, and then I saw her at the store, so yeah, that's what happened. Oh, okay, that's I guess what happened then. So those are just a few of the things that I talk about, but the book's about more than just these specific issues. It's about how to drop your cognitive biases, how to use the same methods that we debunk these myths with in your daily life to make good decisions all around. It's something that should be used throughout the day, no matter what you're doing. So if you want to know more, you can ask me now. We'll do a little Q&A, or you could talk to me when I'm signing books in the back. But thank you guys again very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you have questions, please come up to the mic so everybody can hear you.
This is the person who narrated No Sacred Cows, the book that I'm talking about right now. Thank you very much for doing that.
My pleasure. It was a great book. Am I right? Yeah. So one of the chapters that I went to first, actually, before I read the whole thing, was chapter 5, What's the Harm?
Yep.
And I like what you said up there, that any false belief has the potential to cause harm, even if it doesn't necessarily. I belong to a couple of different groups that are sort of focused on one specific health area. that has science behind it. But invariably, every couple of weeks, every couple of months, homeopathy comes up.
Yep.
And homeopathy has been a soapbox issue for me for 30 years, long before I was an atheist or anything else. I looked at it and I said, this is nonsense, right? But it comes up, and somebody will say, you know, use this, use that, and I try to inject something saying, there is nothing to this. Please educate yourself on what it's actually based on. And just based on what it's based on, you should be able to look at it and say, obviously nothing could work here. But somebody will come in and say, no, there's all kinds of science behind it, and they'll point to studies. And I've looked a couple of these studies up, one of which they always go to was like 20 years ago as a meta-analysis, and the authors of the study actually came back later and said, no, we were wrong, we got the wrong conclusion. And they, of course, won't take that.
Happened same with the vaccine linking autism study. Everybody has rejected it. It's been unpublished, and yet people still use it to promote their pseudoscience. Right.
So my question, and so eventually those conversations, I just kind of leave them. My question to you is, what have you found to be the most effective way to communicate with people? Because if you just say, if I describe what it's based on, and I say, this is not, for an example with homeopathy, one of the basic tenets is the more dilute the substance is, the more effective it will be. And I will say, there is nothing else in the world where this is true. And they can't come up with an example, and yet they'll say, no, but it works for this. So what is your most effective way of discussing topics like that with people to have them finally turn around? Is there an effective way?
There is. It's not something that can happen usually in a first discussion. I'll give one exception in a minute. Homeopathy is an interesting one, though, because I've actually heard an example for that when I say the more dilute the substance is, the more effective it'll be. There's nothing else like that. I've actually heard people say vaccines are like that, and they're really not, but to the simple-minded person who really is trying to grasp at that straw is going to make that connection. So I've actually found that to be a pretty ineffective argument, because they're like, we use vaccines all the time and it works like that, and instead of explaining the complicated processes, it's usually easier. For me, I talk about in the book using the Socratic method on all of these different, regardless of who I'm talking to. I try to be as polite as possible, but I try to ask as many probing questions as possible as well that'll actually make them think, because I'm not trying to really convince them in that conversation. I'm really trying to plant a seed of doubt that'll get them thinking in the long run. Now, the exception I'll talk about for homeopathy was with James Randi. I don't remember if I mentioned in the book, but it's one of the most inspirational moments in all of pseudoscience debunkery, where James Randi is on stage, and I believe there's a homeopathy proponent there with some medicine, and he said to prove it wrong, he's going to walk up and just take this whole bottle of sleeping medicine. Just took every single pill in there, every sugar pill in the entire bottle. And then he just gave the rest of his speech, was perfectly fine, sat around afterward, answered questions, was like, do you still believe that homeopathy is real? Because I should be dead right now if there were any medicine in that at all. And so I found that to be a very powerful message on that issue. And I've seen people who believed in homeopathy see that video even and just react to it like, okay, well, I do have some thinking to do. I have some explanations to myself, and that's all I can really ask of people.
All right,
so
cool.
Thank you.
I'll try to be more probing with the questions.
It helps a lot, because getting people to think is difficult, but once you do, it can lead to some pretty impressive places. I've seen some turnarounds that you wouldn't expect from people who send me messages, F this, F that, you're going to die, you're going to burn in hell, and then I'm just like, hey, what's going on? Like, which one of my posts bothered you? Which one of my speeches bothered you? Let's talk about what's really going on. And almost every time they apologize, and sometimes I even get something more like, this shows that I do have an emotional attachment to this, and maybe I do need to think about why I'm so married to this belief so that it hurts me when you try to take it away.
All right, cool, thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks for narrating No Sacred Cows. Hello.
Oh, I've got a suggestion / question about the whole alien visitation thing. I was reading about this like maybe 15 years ago, and some of these people who've had these visitations have had lesions in their parts of the brain responsible for facial recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And another component was that they felt that something was injected in their hip around there. And I was like, well, maybe they're just having some really, really early memories. So I got in front of my mirror and I had put a little small mirror by my ear and kind of lean over, trying to ruin the depth perception by looking at my reflection in this mirror and the mirror in front of me in the bathroom. Like, well, maybe this is a baby remembering mother kind of changing diapers. And I was wondering, if this is true, the component of having something injected in one's hip would kind of disappear with the disappearance of cloth diapers and pins.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if there's some kind of age cutoff when you have that component of
Interesting.
the conviction that you were abducted by aliens.
Yeah.
And, the whole big eyes and the forehead.
Yeah.
It's kind of anthropometric to assume that aliens from some distant planet would look like us in any remote way.
And that they would work like, their arms would work like us, and they'd be able to operate our doors, and they'd be able to do anything they wanted, really, that operated with a human understanding. That's entirely possible. I do also want to mention sleep paralysis that I talked about before. It actually has all those components as well. Part of sleep paralysis, a lot of times, not every time, but people often feel like they're being poked and prodded. If you're super religious, if you're very, very Catholic, for instance, a lot of people who have sleep paralysis feel like it's demons who tie them down in bed. That's why they're paralyzed, and then pokes and prods them, and that is some people interpret as a warning about hell. You're going to go to hell, and we're going to stab you with pitchforks. And so not necessarily just on the hip, but basically just being prodded and poked by something above you. And if you are a firm believer in aliens, they see that they're being probed by aliens. They see that aliens are hovering over their beds and poking and prodding them. And I've heard it with angels, with ghosts, with demons. Pretty much whatever your cultural belief system is, it comes out when you're having these hallucinations / dreams that are just extremely memorable and a little bit different than dreams you might expect. So while that's definitely possible, I would say the majority, more than 50% of alien and ghost stories that I hear, where they start out, so I was in bed. I'm just like, all right, stop. If you're in bed, probably sleep paralysis. But yeah, there are so many different ways that these types of things could manifest that it's almost impossible to conclude that these alien life forms that we've never proven exist are the culprit, when it's more likely we find something locally that we do know exists. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, yep.
I didn't believe in psychics until my daughter was really ill. And I called a psychic. I was in Tucson, I believe. The psychic was in California. We had never met.
Mm-hmm.
And her first question was, I see a little blonde girl in pain. And that was my daughter. We thought she had MS.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to the psychic, we think she has MS. She said, when was she born? And she may have asked me her name. And she said, no, she does not have MS. She has something pinched in her neck. 6 months later, the doctors found out she had spinal stenosis. I've had 2 interactions with this psychic, who happens to now live in Tucson, and I have met her, but I can't explain it.
Yeah, they're, like I said in the psychic section, a lot of people have these very, very similar stories. I do want to point out that when I was doing my psychic bent on Venice Beach, I said something very similar to a woman and got a hit off of it as well. I said, I'm seeing a small blonde girl and she's in pain. That's actually pretty common to use these types of vague suggestions to get started, because everybody in this room has known a small blonde girl who's been in pain at some point. And the woman said, oh my God, my grandma, when she was very, very young, had I forgot what it was, some extremely crippling disease when she was younger. And that's something that I think about a lot, something that I don't want in my bloodline. And so then I jump to, okay, so something tells me that you're also planning on having children and that this is a concern for you. Oh my God, of course. But she just told me that she was concerned about her bloodline. We give away a lot more information than we think we do. This is all just from a cold reading. And after that, she was so impressed that she wanted to come back, and she wanted to keep coming, and I had to tell her that I was a skeptic and that this was all part of a social experiment. But this is all through cold reading. There's also the process of warm reading, even hot readings, where psychics will actually say you call them on the phone. They don't answer the first time. They look up your number. They get your name. They go to social media. They know almost everything about you. They call you back. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about that. I can't tell you exactly how this specific story happened, but I can tell you that no psychic has ever proven their powers from a scientific perspective. And so if they have these powers, they're hiding them from any way to prove it, which would help humanity, which would do a lot to help fellow man. So it's kind of a selfish thing to do. And from the selfish perspective, it would get them a lot of money to do it. So there are a lot of reasons to prove this type of thing, and it's never been proved in a scientific setting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I wondered if the sleep paralysis phenomenon was a lot like the near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I was resuscitated 3 times one night, and twice I went through seeing this big light field.
Yep.
Being the atheist son of a Baptist deacon, I didn't see anything other than something that looked like sort of Campbell's mushroom soup.
Okay,
but
that's something.
But
There's
lot
something there.
Well, that's probably just synapses
Exactly.
unclicking in my mind. Now, there's a lot of people that are religious report having seen all these. They see Jesus. They see all these things. Well, I'm sure that's things they were raised with that
Exactly.
they see every day. And as their synapses disconnect and so forth. Now, is that similar to sleep paralysis?
I would say in a lot of ways it's similar because it feels so real, just like near-death experiences do. And I do have a chapter on near-death experiences as well in the book, and you are actually right on. It is a cultural phenomenon. You see what you have been raised with, what you're familiar with, what you've seen in movies. People who are extremely religious see heaven or hell. Actually, I've met atheists who saw heaven or hell because they were raised in a Christian family, and that's something that their brain still expected to see. But it's more of a coping mechanism than anything else. With death, when we're in that state, our brain is flooded with certain chemicals, and in the book, I talk about how scientists disagree on exactly which ones and which mixtures and how. But the point is that our brain is trying to prevent itself from having to deal with this catastrophic trauma of death, so it floods good feelings. And those good feelings are often interpreted as Jesus, as something, as a bright light. But I think that the book pretty much disproves near-death experiences as an objective, divine phenomenon, because I talk about studies from other countries where they look into near-death experiences of people in India. And guess what they don't see when they have near-death experiences in India? Jesus and God. They see their deities. They see things that are familiar to them in their culture. And to me, when I realized that, I was like, okay, well, nobody can really argue. I mean, it's something that our brain makes up to make things easier. And in our cultures, that typically is religion. So it's interesting that you didn't actually see any religious figures because you must be that much of a non-believer that you're just like, no.
Yeah, I'd really put that Baptist stuff in the rear view mirror.
Yeah. Well, I'm proud of you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in your segment about ghosts, you had grief up there, but you didn't talk about that. So
I'd actually love to talk about that.
Okay.
So I would say, I think the statistic, it's in the book, but I think it's about 30% of people at some point in their life will experience what's called a grief hallucination. This is when somebody you love or somebody very close to you passes away, usually, and you see remnants of them, or you feel or you hear remnants of them. Oftentimes, if it's somebody who used to walk up behind you and put their hand on your shoulder, you'll feel their hand on your shoulder. And to a lot of people, that's proof that they're a guardian angel, that they're nearby. But this is a well-studied phenomenon, and it's called a grief hallucination. Some people will see the face of someone they know or love in a crowd of people. Some people will have full-on conversations with this hallucination. And again, this is a coping mechanism for our brain. This is something that makes life easier because we just lost somebody that we cared about, somebody that probably meant a lot to us. And so to have that last little goodbye that a lot of us miss is helpful in our mental health. And so evolutionarily speaking, it actually makes a lot of sense that grief hallucinations exist and why they exist. And so just talking to people about it, I think, helps spread awareness, because I know a lot of people who have said, yeah, I don't believe in all that stuff, but I saw a ghost of my dead friend once. And I tell them about grief hallucinations, and a lot of time that helps them understand, helps them put what they saw into context, because it can be a confusing one. So thank you for that question. I forgot to mention that. Yes, sir.
I think it's possible, at least, and you certainly need to be prepared to argue or to respond to the argument, that grief hallucination or sleep paralysis are just names for an unexplained phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So what you would need to do then is to get into the physical mechanisms, if you believe there are physical mechanisms for these things. And I know you mentioned earlier, well, it's a confusion between the sleep-on, sleep-off switch. It's just naming still until you get to an actual mechanism, because you're trying to work in a materialist vein here, right? That's what you're discounting is all the non-materialist responses to these things. So you need to be able to describe the mechanism. Otherwise, all you've really done is rename it.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people say that before. They're like, yeah, I've heard of sleep paralysis, but that's just the word for aliens visiting me. But then other people think sleep paralysis is the word for God visiting them, or for demons, or for Jesus, or for just about anything. So it makes sense, again, if you look at it from a cultural perspective, these are things that they expect to see as opposed to things that are objectively true. It's not likely that aliens, gods, Jesus all use the same mechanism to invade our sleep time. It's more likely, and explained by evolution and by scientists now, because sleep paralysis specifically is very well explained. It just makes more sense to believe that that's the case. But I have heard that exact, well, that's just a word for this. And I feel like that's a pretty shallow response, because you're kind of ignoring all the science at that point that actually points to these mechanisms. And when you do that, you kind of you lose a lot there, I think. But yeah, I've responded to that before, and I think it's an interesting argument. But in the grand scheme of things, it really falls flat when you realize how many different types of hallucinations happen during this process of sleep paralysis. I've actually had sleep paralysis where it was nothing supernatural at all. I was in bed, and 6 people broke into my house, I thought. They started ransacking my house and taking stuff from drawers, and I thought that I was paralyzed by fear. I was like getting up to fight them, but I couldn't. And this is just because it's, again, we know evolutionarily why our bodies stay immobilized during sleep so that our ancestors didn't fall from the trees. We have this mechanism that exists, and sometimes it malfunctions. And so that's a big part of it as well.
I'm a spiritual person. I'm a professed Christian, not to take away from the Hindu in India. In this body, we've talked a lot about, I believe, help me in my unbelief as a proof for going into more of the secular line of thought. I, at that time, argued that that's not the case. But anyway, my point is it seems to precipitate a lot of these why so many people believe in God. There's a number 37 that says, no one has ever disproved the existence of my God. And that seems to be a true statement. And a lot of these other things precipitate that can be then. It can be a good thing. Were there Christian wars? Were there wrong things? Are there wrong things that happen because of religion? Of course. But
nobody has disproved any particular God. That's that.
No. No one has ever disproved the existence of a God.
Yeah, that's very true. No one has disproved the existence of a celestial teapot. Nobody has disproved the existence of the flying spaghetti monster. I mean, this argument has taken many, many incarnations, and the disproof of something, requiring the using not being disproved as the only reason to believe something never made sense to me. But I've heard that many, many times. But I say in the book that when you don't have a reason to, when you don't have disproof, but you don't have proof, why would your natural inclination be to believe in it? You know, mine would be to regard it with skepticism until that proof comes. But again, that's the scientific skeptic mindset, and that's not what everybody shares. A lot of people need that belief. A lot of people have an ingrained belief in their genetics. It's something that, evolutionarily speaking, belief in religion has helped us a lot through society. I know groups like this usually hate when I say that, but it's true. Religions helped bind tribes together early on, and that helped people build communities. It helped people be familiar with each other and understand each other and trust each other and watch out for each other. And then what happens when you bind a bunch of groups together in these different religions? When they actually clash, it creates tension and problems. And so there's the good and the bad, but that's something that also needs to be acknowledged. Thank you.
You can't prove there isn't a God, but you can't prove there is a God either.
Exactly.
So that's why all of us should be agnostics.
Yep.
Because we cannot prove there is or isn't a God.
Yep.
And
I say in the book that I'm an agnostic atheist, and when people ask me what that means, it means I don't believe and I don't know. That's both, and that both, I feel like that describes me pretty well. I don't know for sure, which is actually why I don't believe, because I'm not going to believe in something that I'm not confident about.
Hi, I was wanting to know your thoughts on the reasons behind the extent to which one culture or country is more predominantly religious than another country or culture. And you know, the United States, if I recall, is generally speaking more religiously active than a lot of particularly European countries. Mm-hmm. And I guess to this point in my life, I've sort of just assumed that was probably a result of just basic fundamental education. Personally, I wasn't ever taught until after I was actually out of school, learned on my own, much about the basic tenets of evolution, geology, genetics, and things like that. And are we still letting kids down like that or not?
Definitely.
And then the second question is, the United States has a tremendous diversity within that religious belief system, right? Mm-hmm. There's so many different types of religions. And is that a similar event in other countries as well, that diversity?
Yes. To answer your questions in order, the reasons that different countries have the different varying levels of belief are twofold. Number one is culture. Americans early on put a lot of their culture, a lot of their eggs in the religion basket as opposed to focusing on other aspects of their culture. Other religions, especially in Europe, or other regions, especially in Europe, they tend to leave religion to be a personal matter. They don't put it as much in the public square, and that's more a matter of culture than a lot of things. But you actually touched on a really important point, which is the second point, and it's what I discussed when I was here 3 years ago, the importance of teaching religion to children. Because in most places in Europe, they teach religious literacy at a very young age. You start in school and you learn about math and science and geography and religion. And you learn about how different people believe, how much they believe, things that they've done in the past. And what that does is it gives young people a perspective that they don't have a lot of the times in the US. That's actually partially because of our separation of church and state. Now, separation of church and state doesn't mean you can't teach religion in school from an objective academic perspective, but a lot of people take it to mean that. They think that you can't mention religion in school. So they took religion completely out of schools to the point that they leave it to the personal life, they leave it to the family, to the parents, and then what happens? You grow up your whole life only familiar with your religion, with whatever religion you grew up with, whether it's a branch of Christianity or anything else. And they end up not having that wider perspective, not knowing that in many cases that other religions exist. And then they fight the teaching of things like evolution in schools to put it off even further. Some people are 18 before they learn what evolution really is. It's something that definitely needs to be addressed in our schools, and it's something that I've been fighting for a long time, to get better education, especially when it comes to religion, so that people can see that their parents' religion isn't superior. It isn't some special religion that is true and everything else is wrong. It helps to know that other people have these equally important beliefs that they're just as fervent about. As far as the multiculturalism and the multi-religions of the United States, it's obviously still very heavily Christian. I mean, even most of the denominations count as their own little religions, like Mormonism is a denomination of Christianity. Jehovah's Witnesses are Christians as well. So definitely the vast majority is Christians, but we do tend to have a lot more diversity in general than a lot of countries. And when that happens, you have other beliefs mixed in. You have that melting pot effect. And just like in history, when I majored in religious studies, a lot of the stuff I learned about was trade routes. I know it's weird, but when you have one country trading with this country here, you can actually look on a time scale and see where they picked up beliefs from this country because they were visiting so often. They told stories, then they came back, they added a new god to their pantheon because this was a god that they had over there. It's pretty fascinating, and the same thing happens in the US today, where new religions are founded based on these similarities and combinations. And what you see now a lot of times with people who say they're Buddhist, for instance, in the United States, they're practicing something that usually isn't very related to the original Buddhism. We kind of created our own Western Buddhism here. And so it's definitely fascinating to see how those religions evolved, and in places with more diversity, you're going to have more of that. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to get your idea on some observations that I have been making over the years. A number of us have wondered, why does it appear to be such a difficult issue for a believer to do some of the things you've been talking about? Be a more critical thinker and then act on the conclusions your critical thinking leads you to. We have, or I guess I will own this, it seems to me that there are three great fears that people have, and I'm curious as to whether you run across these or have others. The first one is to simply admit that we have been wrong.
Yep, that's the biggest one.
The second one is recognizing that if we act on what we discover, that we may lose our support group, we may lose our family, we may lose our income. And then the third one is the big 1-2 punch with religions, that we may spend eternity in a horrible place.
Yeah.
So those are the three bigs that I see. Do you see anything different?
Not only do I agree with those, but I agree with the order in which you said them, because admitting we're wrong for anybody is a difficult concept, and it's why I talk about it a lot in No Sacred Cows. I actually list times and talk about times in recent years when I've been proven wrong about stuff that I was extremely confident about, because I feel like it's important to recognize that we can all do that we can all admit we're wrong and move on. And the reasons why we can't do that are actually extremely complicated, but there's this book called Mistakes Were Made, in parentheses, but not by me. And I highly recommend this book. It teaches you all about self-justification, about cognitive dissonance, about why it's so difficult for us to admit that we're wrong. It destroys our self-perception, is the general consensus. It's something that we spend our whole lives thinking, okay, I'm a reasonable person, I'm pretty smart. I think so. To admit that we've been wrong about something, especially something we based our whole life on, especially something that our parents, our trusted loved ones told us when we were very young, it can be life-shattering. It's like admitting everything you've ever known is wrong, and it's something that takes more than just some clever quips. It takes a lot of time, a lot of thinking, and that's what a lot of people try to avoid. When it comes to your second point, to community, I think that's a huge part of it as well. And I actually write in one of the books I have back there, Mom, Dad, I'm an Atheist, The Guide to Coming Out as a Non-Believer. I write about establishing a new sense of community and how it's important for people who finally do become secular or leave their religion, to find something to replace that. A lot of people, their religion is everything. They go to school with the same religious people. They go to the same church. Their whole town or community, in a lot of cases, is filled with religion. And so to replace all of that in one fell swoop is very difficult, especially in religions where you're blacklisted or otherwise cut off from your people, the people that you've known your whole life. So establishing a new sense of community is extremely important, and that's why I see the value in groups like this, because people who might not have their church anymore can come here, meet friends, talk, have food, do volunteer activities, and get that same basic structure and that same societal need of having these people around without having the nonsense behind it. So very good points. I like those a lot. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
This is a great forum. So I just had more of a comment, really. So I went to Europe a couple of years ago for the first time. And what I found was really interesting. I was in Ireland, and I met this person, and he told me he was a devout atheist. And so I was surprised. I thought, an atheist in Ireland? This is very strange. And one of the things he pointed out to me, which I had never thought of, though I've lived here all my life, he said, what other country in the world puts on their money, "In God we trust"? Because, you know, those two concepts that you talked about, separation of church and state, however, you know, we have that on our money.
Yep.
You know, I have in my wallet right now a 20-pound note from Britain, and it has the Queen, you know, who's the head of state, and also on the back it has a little blurb about commerce, because that's what money is about. It's about commerce
Crazy,
and
right?
change. So I don't think those two things are separated.
Oh, they're not.
Yeah.
No, the separation of church and state is a huge problem in the United States, the way that it's separated, because it's really not. And as you might know, that wasn't something that was founded. Our money didn't start off with "In God We Trust" on it. That was something that was added on paper money not too long ago. And that's something to combat the Red Scare, to combat communism, to galvanize people. Again, this is a tribal thing. It brings people together against the outgroup, against even a non-existent outgroup, or even an outgroup that isn't really a threat. It brings people together, and that was the original point of that. And today they argue that it's not a federal endorsement of a religion because it's the federal endorsement of a god. It could be any god, and so therefore, to them, to the Supreme Court at least, it's not considered against the Establishment Clause. I disagree with that, however. I've also noticed in certain places, like in Canada, they don't have in their constitution a separation of church and state like we have, yet in practice they have a much more separated church of state. It has a lot to do with the culture. It's more, like I said before, about it being a personal belief to those people as opposed to something that they have to legislate and force other people into.
Right.
It's kind of a uniquely American mindset, really. I also want to note that I saw, I don't remember where it was, but I have a foreign note from somewhere with Charles Darwin on it, and I just thought that was amazing. So.
That was a taboo topic in Catholic school.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
On a lighter note, I have a relative, I won't say if it's a he or a she, or which side of the family it's on.
I'll guess.
Who has a way of, she apparently...
She. Got it. I'm a good psychic, yeah.
She went through this process that was very successful, and she seems to claim that it works over and over again. And the process is, when a full moon comes...
Already funny.
Well, let me tell you, before I did this, I bought a lottery ticket. And she said, go out under the full moon, hold open your wallet, and say, fill her up, fill her up, fill her up. We actually did that. Do you have any other ways you know of to win the lottery?
Well, actually, there's one guy who has won the lottery, I think, 8 to 10 times, and his secret is not magic or psychics or anything. It's science and math, figuring out when the best times to buy, where the best locations to buy, and he actually wrote a book on it, so you could probably win the lottery if you're good enough at it.
Are people motivated to keep their religion because they want to go to heaven and eternally have a pleasant place, or that they would burn in hell? Which one turns them on?
Oh, it's the carrot and the stick approach for sure. You have both of those, and there are people who are differently motivated. Not all of us work the same way. So religions usually have a way to punish and reward to kind of capture all those different types of people. It's very, very interesting when you look at like the advent of these fire and brimstone preachers that didn't always exist. Normally, in history, they usually focused on the heaven. They usually focused on the happiness. But in the United States, they kind of turned toward this fire and brimstone, which works on some people. You got to scare them into the pews, you know. Otherwise, your religion's going to lose its power if fewer and fewer people are coming to church. And so they just started saying, well, if you don't come here, you're going to die and be tortured for eternity. So I'll see you on Sunday. So it definitely works for different people. I never found either of those approaches persuasive for myself, especially because if I'm imagining myself in heaven, I definitely know people who I love and care about who would be in hell, and that would make it my personal hell, knowing that they're being tortured for eternity just for believing differently than me. And I know a lot of people who share that feeling. If they have a husband or a wife, for instance, that believes differently from them, how do you justify that? When you do go to heaven, how is that going to work out? And the traditional Christian answer has been, oh, don't worry, God will wipe your memory. You won't even know that person existed. And I'm like, oh, even better. Get a brainwash.
Some people don't want their relatives to be there with them.
Yep, that's true too.
Yeah.
Good riddance.
Now, I also wanted to mention James Randi has $1 million set aside for any psychics or anybody that can do it under controlled conditions and prove that they really are psychic.
Yep.
And it's gone unclaimed now for, 20-some years.
Yep, I write about that in the book as well, and including there's actually a couple of those. Some are $100,000, some are $1 million, but they set up these objective criteria by which you could prove a supernatural power if you actually had one. And I encourage people who say that they know psychics, for instance, this person definitely is psychic. Okay, go here, get $1 million, win a Nobel Prize, change not just the history of the world, but change how we look at medicine. Using psychic powers, we could learn more than just what's wrong in my particular family. We can look at what's wrong in society. We could solve global issues. We could solve world hunger. We could do a lot of things. And it seems like people are either hesitant or they take the test and fail. And one of my favorite instances of that was Uri Geller, who could obviously, very clearly, he could move things with his mind. He's telekinetic. So he would put a pen down and move it with his mind. And all James Randi had to do was walk up and sprinkle some sawdust in front of him and say, okay, now do it. Because he knew he was blowing on it very subtly and moving it with his breath. And all of a sudden, Uri Geller said, oh, my powers are blocked. I can't do it. So apparently sawdust cures telekinesis. So now we know that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you had a recommendation specifically for books on how to teach yourself to be a psychic. And the reason for that is I think it's very hard to disprove something. Like James Randi is not the most personable guy.
No.
And so he just pisses people off. And it's far easier if you can do something where you can actually like say, well, you know, not only can James Randi disprove Uri Geller, but you can too. And you can also be a psychic.
Yep.
And so that's one question is, do you seriously have the names of books that you can teach yourself? The other question is, I'm just wondering what you see spectrum-wise in terms of belief in the supernatural between age groups, because we're obviously a much older age group, and what do you see among people your own age that makes them tend to believe or not believe?
Okay, so the first question, I'd like maybe if you come up to the table when I'm done, and I'll give you my email, because I have like 50 books on how to be a psychic. I also took an online course that was free that I could point you to. It was very, very fascinating. I also read a lot of books by psychics, which really helped me get into their mind, even if they weren't trying to teach me how to do what they do. I was getting a feel for it by reading their books. I forgot the second question now.
The second question is just, what do you see differences?
Oh, the age groups. Surprisingly, not that much of a difference. Depending on the groups that I've talked to, I've seen age groups very young when I speak to college campuses. I've seen older age groups. And it seems like there is a pretty consistent percentage of people who believe in something supernatural. And that thing that they believe that's supernatural tends to vary by age. So my little sister is 18 years old. She is a flat earther. She believes that the earth is flat. I have not been able to talk her out of it yet, but I just found out a couple weeks ago. I gave her my book, and she's going to be reading it, so that should be fun. That tends to be more popular with the younger crowd. Also, flat earth, just a historical note, has never been a very popular belief. Columbus, contrary to popular belief, did understand that the world was spherical. Ancient Romans understood that the world was spherical based on measurements of shadows. And people today, more people per capita today, believe in a flat earth than any time in our history. It's really mind-blowing. And it's because of celebrity culture. It's because these people who are speaking out about these issues are extremely ill-informed about science, but extremely famous, and people look up to them. It's a problem with social media and with celebrity culture. So those beliefs that are popular among those people, anti-vax beliefs as well, that's another one that's brought on a lot by celebrities and linked to the younger crowd a lot more. And then when I address different groups, like groups like this one and related groups, I might get more of this vague sense of spirituality, or more a belief in a passive belief in an afterlife of some kind, or a belief in ghosts, or a belief in a psychic because they had this experience usually when they're younger. So yeah, the belief itself, the type of belief changes, but the belief itself really stays the same. It's kind of interesting.
Hi. Having been raised by a family and society that was predominantly Mennonite, we also, Anabaptist group, we had other Anabaptist groups, and one of them was one that I mentioned in an early session this morning, the German Baptists. This is to lead into a joke. And it has to do with being in heaven. And the joke goes that a group of people went to heaven, and they were getting the tour by somebody, maybe Peter or St. Peter or somebody, and there was this one room that was closed off to everybody else. And they said, well, what's behind that door? And they said, well, that's the German Baptists in there. They think they're the only ones that are here. Number two, were you raised religious and come out of religion? And if anything you want to say about that,
Definitely.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I like that joke, especially because it can be applied to so many different types of religion. I could make the same joke of Mormons or anything else. I actually was raised in a Christian family. Both my parents are Christians, or were Christians at the time. My mom is now an atheist and a free thinker and a humanist, thanks in large part to my speeches and my books and stuff like that. So she's amazing. She's a former Jehovah's Witness. It takes a lot of work to leave that cult, so I'm very proud of her. My dad just left the Mormon church 3 months ago. Very complicated family dynamics. My grandparents, with whom I lived as a child, were both fundamentalist Christians who believed in a young earth. The earth is only 6,000 years old. It was created in 6 days. Women shouldn't speak in church. Whatever it says in the Bible is true. I even convinced my grandma that some things were true because I said that they were in the Bible. And she said, if it's in there, I believe it. And I'm like, okay, well, you just said something that's completely not in there. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But I personally was never a believer. I can't remember a time when I believed in any God or any religion. And a lot of people ask me, and they're like, oh, so you were probably just so smart that you knew that it was all bullshit when you were very young. And no, I was actually so stupid that I didn't know people took it seriously. That people, I I loved church. It was one of my favorite activities as a kid. I would go, I would sing the songs, I'd get candy, I would learn these cool stories, I'd learn about Joseph and his coat of many colors. I was like, these are awesome tales. I get the ethical values. I understand all this. And then one day I told my grandma I didn't want to go to church, and she said, oh, well, you're going to go to hell. And I was like, wait, you believe that? I was like, you believe that God drowned everyone on earth except for one family in a boat? Oh, yes. I'm like, oh, I've been looking at this entirely wrong my whole life. So that was about 13 when I realized people actually believed in religions. I thought the whole time that they were just like stories. And so I started, instead of being scared away from the church like a lot of people would have been, I kind of started going more and more often because I was just so curious about how people can believe these things, and also how other people can believe different crazy things that are just equally, you know, they believe them just as much as my family believed this, but they're completely different. They can't interact, completely contradictory. So I started going to churches and temples and going to everything I could, and then when I was 18 and I went away to college, I decided to major in religious studies to learn even more about that, and so people weren't really surprised when I told them that was my major. They were like, oh, that makes sense. Thank you.
I was just wondering your thoughts on kind of maybe like poking fun and lampooning kind of friends you might have, real life or Facebook, you know, not, I want to say this, you know, specifically not with malicious intent or anything like that, but equating their religious beliefs to Bigfoot or flat earth, you know, UFOs. How far do you take, you know, how much do you poke fun at that kind of stuff, everything like that?
Well, I guess I'm a little ignorant here because I don't see that as poking fun, but I do compare them all the time because they're very comparable. Supernatural beliefs in general, and that isn't necessarily including Bigfoot, although there are people who think that Bigfoot is an interdimensional being, which is why we don't have any bodies or any fecal matter or anything like that. He only appears at certain times and then disappears into another dimension. So these things are intrinsically linked, and so I bring it up a lot, and people do see it as an attack, and it's unfortunate because I'm never trying to attack anyone. I might make light jokes. I was banned from Facebook for 30 days for posting a picture of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. And Bill Gates says, I believe in vaccines and medicines and hospitals. And Steve Jobs says, I believe in homeopathy and crystals and something else. And then they said, OK, well, let's see who lives longer. And it is in bad taste. It is in bad taste. But it's also true. And Steve Jobs did deny Western medicine in his treatments of one of the most aggressive types of cancer of all time, in favor of something like homeopathy, in favor of crystals. And so this is something that really causes problems. It could have, I don't know that it would have saved his life, but it could have given him more time. It could have saved his life if he had used more traditional medicine. And so the jokes that I make, I try to make sure that they have a real point that people can get and understand. But I do find that even when I'm just comparing things and not making jokes, people do get offended, and that's part of the process because it's cognitive dissonance. They're upset that their beliefs are being challenged more than they're upset about my joke.
Thanks a lot for coming today. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Just as an aside, do you know what Steve Jobs' last words were?
I do not.
According to his sister, the last things he said as he was passing on was, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow."
Oh wow. My guess is that that was a near-death experience, maybe. Yes, sir.
I find it interesting that the Pew reports here a few years ago found that more than 50% of the Christians do now no longer believe in hell. So they are completely divided amongst themselves as to whether there's even a hell or not, let alone figuring out where it's at, which has always been my question. If there's a heaven, where's it at?
Yep.
And
Mormons believe it's right up there on a planet.
Well, and we had some people that committed suicide about 30, 40 years ago, that they were going to go get on a comet and ride that to heaven.
Yep.
You name it, there's been all kinds of ways of trying to find heaven. and it always irks me. They point up and say heaven above. Well, that's space.
We're on a sphere. We're
so
spinning, guys.
I go, okay, what part of that is heaven at? Because space is 2.1 degrees absolute. Is that the kind of a temperature you want to live in heaven? And that's empirical.
Yep.
That's not guessing. So I have to question anybody who says there's a heaven, because the original heaven was below a flat earth. And that's the reason people, when I was young, which I haven't been to church in years, the minister always tells you to bow your heads, which means you're going to face down towards heaven below the earth. And that's exactly, and not only that, all of your ancient references to the sun were to it being put away in heaven at night below earth, the flat earth. If you go around to the other side of this round earth today, you'll find it's down there in heaven on the other side of where you were. So you name it. That's I could just go on with this.
Yeah, there are 41,000 denominations of Christianity. So they, like you said, they don't agree on heaven, they don't agree on hell, they don't agree about basically anything. But I imagine the response by a Christian church today would say that your church was run by the devil, and that's why he wanted you to believe that the heaven was below. That's also why Sunday is the most divided day of the nation, of the week. Yep. Happy Sunday, everyone.
Yeah, there you go. So my other point is, scientists write up equations and hypotheses to try to prove something true or false, and there has never been a hypothesis written on religion. So how can they possibly say that it has to be true when they can't even write a hypothesis so we can do something about it? Yep. That becomes a ridiculous statement to even say it's true when you can't write something to prove your own hypothesis.
It's all about faith.
Which you don't have one because you've never written one.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of the antithesis of science. It's completely faith-based. I believe this because this book tells me to, as opposed to I believe this based on empirical evidence. It's really crazy to see the difference in mindsets, but that's what we're trying to fix.
And I also have a religious joke.
Okay. And then you want to end it there? Yeah. Now go sign books and stuff? Okay. Better be a good joke.
This ISIS guy got bombed, and he's all burning and on fire, and he comes up the pearly gates, and St. Peter said, well, there's a Muslim. I better send out an imam to meet him. And the guy comes up there, and the imam goes out and meets him, and says, welcome to heaven, and he says, yeah, I'm here to get my 86 virgins. And he says, oh, I think there was a slight mistake in that reading. It's an 86-year-old nun.
Oh, good one. Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it.
Give him a big hand here, okay? Can you go to lunch?
We actually have to go right to Sierra Vista.
That's what I thought. Okay. Some of us will go to lunch at 2500C at the cafeteria. He's going to give a talk down at Sierra Vista after this, so he's still on his book tour. So I think we had a good meeting, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Okay. Thanks for coming.